are also available in Spanish for any radio station to take. I'm Amy Goodman. The renowned South African poet and activist Dennis Brutus died in his sleep Saturday in Cape Town. He was 85 years old. Brutus was a leading opponent of the apartheid state. He helped secure South Africa's suspension from the Olympics, eventually forcing the country to be expelled from the Games in 1970. He was arrested in 1963. Excuse me, sentenced to 18 months in hard labor on Robben Island. We're going to turn now to an interview I did with him in 2005.
Talking about reparations, talking about apartheid. You, Dennis Brutus, spent time with Nelson Mandela on Robben Island. You were imprisoned,
right.
Broke rocks together.
That's right.
You have seen the latest news of President Mandela coming to the United States, the former president of South Africa. He met with President Bush. Your thoughts on this? I know there was some concern among activist groups to give President Bush that kind of seal of approval.
There's a very striking difference between the Mandela, who was quite blunt in his criticism, not only of the U.S. entry into Iraq, but also the election itself. So we had some very frank speaking at that time. And surprisingly, now we find Mandela visiting with President Bush and saying, oh, well, friends have this way of criticizing each other. So in a sense, he's climbing down from his previous criticism. And I suppose the explanation is that when he came to the United States, it was mainly in order to raise funds for one of the Mandela foundations. So it seems to me being very polite, I would say excessively polite, and indeed for people who knew him as someone who spoke out bluntly, this is not only a surprise, it's also a disappointment. We think he should have maintained his position.
Well, what about Mandela's power today and President Bush's relationship with him and the current president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki?
Generally, Mandela has chosen to take the role of an elder statesman and to be fairly soft-spoken. On the other hand, as we know, that George Bush has been very cordial towards Thabo Mbeki, the new president, and indeed has called Mbeki his point man in Africa when it comes to questions like Zimbabwe. So there's a much warmer relationship between Thabo Mbeki and President Bush. Mandela was rather more distant, so it's a little surprising that he's now being more cordial, and as I say, the explanation is probably that he came on an enormous fundraising venture, met with some of the big corporations, especially the arms industry, and that explains the change, I suppose.
We're talking to Dennis Brutus. He has a latest book, a collection of his poems called Leaf Drift. Some of these poems were written under a pseudonym, some when you were in prison. Can you talk about them and share one with us?
Well, yes, you're right. Some of them were written when it was a crime for me to publish.
Why crime?
Others were smuggled while I was on Robben Island, smuggled out of the prison. But in fact, most of this is new and deals, in fact, with a new South African situation where, surprisingly, we come out of apartheid into global apartheid. We're in a world now where, in fact, wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few. The mass of the people are still poor. According to the World Bank itself, there are literally millions now below the poverty line, so that the situation is actually deteriorating. And this is quite striking in South Africa. As water is privatized, as electricity is privatized, as people are evicted even from their shacks because they can't afford to pay the rent of the shacks, the situation becomes worse. And it seems to me at the heart of the matter is the fact that the South African government under the ANC and Mbeki have chosen to adopt the corporate solution. They say, oh, globalization is inevitable. And we think that's not true. You can have a globalizing process which takes care of the people's interests, or you can have a globalizing process which instead focuses on the corporations. You give tax reductions to the rich. You increase the tax on bread and sugar and coffee and tea and petrol, gas for cars, because these things affect the poor. On the other hand, you are actually cutting the taxes on luxury goods, so that in fact your whole society is geared to keep the corporations happy and allow them actually to go offshore, so they don't even have to pay tax. They can pay tax in the Cayman Islands or the Bahamas or somewhere. But a society which is geared to protect the rich and the corporations and actually is hammering the poor, increasing their burden. This is the reverse of what we thought was going to happen under the ANC government.
A poem from Leaf Drift. Could you share with us?
Right. I think it would be appropriate to read a poem which is actually about our current protest. You may know, and I think you covered it on Democracy Now!, when we were marching against Kofi Annan and Colin Powell and the World Summit on Sustainable Development. People were marching from the ghettos, from the townships, to this expensive suburb called Santon, where you had this enormous expense, lavish expenditure, and talk about making the world a better place, when in fact the world was becoming a worse place. So we have a poem about it, and I'm going to read that, which is just about the march. When we marched, slithered through slimy mud, past riot-shielded cops in Alexander, this is the ghetto, while children peered wild-eyed from dark windows. For some of us, these were reruns of earlier apartheid-burdened days. But then it was defiant resolution that drove our hearts and braced our feet. Now sadness at betrayal sat sadly on our hearts. Our shouted slogans hung heavy over us in grimy air. We winced at familiar, oft repeated lies, oft repeated lies.
Dennis Brutus, reading from his latest collection of poetry called Leaf Drift. Why Leaf Drift?
Well, I know people have been a little puzzled, and my own sense is that I was unable to find a single unifying theme. So the image that came to me was more of leaves blowing around in the wind and then accumulating in a corner, kind of drifting together. So it's a random collection. Some of it is personal, some of it is political. I think leaf drift is a good word, which gathers that sense of things together.
As you look back over your 80 years, your own personal as well as the state of the world, and you look ahead, do you feel like society, civilization is advancing?
Advancing, I'm not sure, but I have a sense of gathering energy.